Hello, everyone. So we're going to start the webinar now. Just before I begin, if there are any technical difficulties during this process, please make sure you reach out to me via the chat, which you all have access to. So please just send me a message on the chat letting me know that you can't hear me, and then I will either attempt to resolve that situation or we will try to figure something out. Just keep in mind that this webinar is recorded, just like all the other webinars here. So you may always watch any and all of these again, or if you missed them or can't make it for the entire process, please keep in mind that these webinars are available online, and that's something that you will have as preparation material going into HMUN India. So don't worry or don't stress if you miss some of it. You'll always have access to the full content later on. So just a couple of really quick things. So I'm going to be talking today about how to structure an argument. And the webinar is predominantly going to focus on that topic area. I do want this to be an interactive discussion, so please do send as many questions as you can. So it seems like there are a couple of people who aren't getting any access. If you can hear me, or if you can see me, can you please type in the chat that you can? So please type in the chat if you can see me, if you can hear me. Okay, great, fantastic. All right, so there seems to be some kind of delay, so I think that's why a couple of people were sort of not hearing anything for a little while, but I think it should be okay now. If you still can't hear anything, please message me, or please message someone on Secretariat so that they can help you out or assist you. But again, these webinars are available online, and you do have the opportunity to view them later should you wish to do so. So a couple of quick introductions then. So my name is Pavan Hegde. I'll be the director of the International Monetary Fund this year at HMUN India. And I've been involved in Model UN for about 3 years now. So at college, I really started to get more involved in Model UN. The first sort of team I joined was the HMUN team at Harvard, which is the team that focuses on intercollegiate Model United Nations. And then after being involved with HMUN for a little bit, I got involved with Harvard Model United Nations and Harvard Model United Nations China. And over the past year, I was on Secretariat for both those conferences. So I was the Undersecretary General for Innovation and Technology at HMUN and the Undersecretary General of Operations for HMUN China. I've been to HMUN India last year, and it was a fantastic experience. I really, really enjoyed it. I don't think there are many conferences out there that have such an incredible wealth of talent when it comes to the delegates, when it comes to the people who are just so focused and dedicated on their topic areas. The directors put a lot of thought and work and effort into making sure the background guides are of fantastic quality, and I know the Secretariat works incredibly hard to make sure that the conference runs smoothly and make sure that the conference has kept up the standards that HMUN India has done over the last years that HMUN India has been running. So really, I enjoy the conference. Hyderabad is a fantastic place, and I can't wait to be there. So at Harvard, I study applied math and economics. I am a third year at Harvard. I just finished my third year, which means I'll be going into my fourth year now. I grew up in Hong Kong, but I've been living over the last 3 years in the United States for university. So that's a little bit about me. Things other than Model UN that I do, just to give you guys a little bit of perspective. So I'm involved with a couple of things on campus that are involved with running and some sports, including rugby, and that's really been the area where I've been focusing on. So I ran across the Gobi Desert over the last year. I trained and I had a race at the Gobi, and that was a lot of fun. And I'm really looking forward to going back and doing those things. So a little bit about after we're done with introductions now, let's talk a little bit about why you should really feel incredibly grateful and incredibly lucky that you're coming to HMUN India. I know that I am, and I feel incredibly lucky because I'm very passionate about my topic area that I wrote for the International Monetary Fund, and it's that topic area that I know delegates are going to discuss with such thought and such creativity that I'm really excited to see what all of you come up with in my committee and in all other committees as well, because so many different perspectives exist out there and all of you are very well researched. And HMUN India really is just a melting pot of ideas. And that's why coming to HMUN India really not only enriches your academic experience, but gives you a sort of cultural and a social experience that I think is hard to find elsewhere with such a talented group of individuals. And that's why HMUN India is a great place to be, and that's why I'm really looking forward to it. So let's talk a little bit about how to structure an argument. And the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to do it from like a big picture and then whittle down approach. So first we're going to talk a little bit about what Model United Nations is and the positions that you are given in Model United Nations. Then I'm going to tell you what really directors look for when it comes to structuring an effective speech. Not necessarily an argument, but structuring an effective speech. And I will talk to you about the different components there. Keep in mind that I'm not here to talk to you in entirety about how to create a perfect speech, and everything I say doesn't necessarily mean that if you do those things, it's a good thing. If you don't do those things, it's a bad thing. This is my opinion on how to create and how to structure an argument. There are many different ways of doing things, and so it's an important thing to keep in your mind that while I might have certain opinions on why certain arguments work in a good way or a bad way, there's no right or wrong objective answer on this situation. Everything is subjective. Everything is sort of an art more than a science. And that's important to keep in mind when you're thinking about creating arguments, but also structuring them and presenting them, that everyone who views you, especially in a competition like Model United Nations, especially in that kind of conference format, it's all very subjective. So just keep that in mind, okay? So after talking about an effective speech, we're going to actually talk through the components of what makes a good argument, and then we're going to talk a little bit at the end about sort of frequently asked questions. And if you guys have any questions during this process, always feel free to message me, and I'll read out the question in case people have the same question and want to hear it again, and then I'll help answer that question. So please do use the chat as effectively as you see fit going forward. So, Model United Nations. So in Model UN, you are assigned a country and you're assigned a committee. Sure, you have some degree of flexibility to which committees you apply to, but at the end of the day, it's really the director who's making the decision on what topics are being spoken at the committee. And the director, of course, has a wealth of experience that gives them the ability to decide what topics would be good for a committee in terms of generating discussion and debate. So at Harvard, we spend a lot of time thinking about what topics will be useful and most interesting to all of you delegates. And on top of that, what kind of academic research, what kind of sources are available about the argument outside is also something that we take into consideration when writing our background guides and when thinking about what kind of topics and what kind of areas or avenues of debate we'd like to go on. So in Model UN, you're given a position, you're assigned a topic pretty much, right? So the first thing to keep in mind when it comes to arguing for anything where you have an assigned position that you may not necessarily believe in, but it's one you have to argue within the parameters of the debate, is that you need to make sure that you defend your position and that you push for what you believe is to be true in a collaborative way, but also you need to keep in mind that delegates are in the same position as you. That collaboration is the most important thing because not every delegate there believes the position that their country has been assigned. And that's particularly important when it comes to Model United Nations and HMUN India specifically, which focuses a lot on collaboration and focuses a lot on teamwork. HMUN India delegates that do well are the ones that collaborate with other delegates in committee sessions. They're the ones that have the opportunity to go up and talk to the directors. They're the ones who have the opportunity to create solutions that are both sort of creative but also involve a large section of the committee. So it's really all about collaboration. And I think going forward, especially into this webinar, it's important to keep in mind that the assigned positions that someone is defending or someone is arguing may not necessarily be what they truly believe in. It might be a function of the fact that they have to argue for a specific position, the fact that they have to argue for a specific topic area. And that's an important thing to keep in mind when you're a delegate in a Model UN conference, but also really any other sort of verbal assigned debate. And that's an important skill set to keep in mind. But why am I telling you this, right? The reason I'm telling you this is not only to focus on collaboration, but it's also a mental and psychological exercise, because to be able to leave the personal outside the debate room is really important. And I think that that's something that as a director, I look for a lot. That when you're in the committee session, you are a representative of the country that you have been assigned. And when you're outside the committee session, you are a delegate and you try to make friends and you try to leave behind things that happen in the committee session rooms and you try to make good connections with all of the people around you. I think that's really what separates delegates who come out of HMUN India feeling like they've got the most, or any Model UN conference at the end of the day. Make sure you make friends, make sure you understand that what people are saying to you may not necessarily be what they believe in, but it's something that they're going to argue for at the end of the day. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's talk about what makes an effective speech as a whole. So in my view, a speech has several components, but the big components really are the argumentation that goes into the speech, and then the sort of presentation value that comes with the speech. Both are equally important, okay? So it's not important for, it's not fair for someone to just say, well, you had fantastic argumentation, but you didn't present that well. Or you had fantastic presentation, but your argumentation wasn't that good. Both of those situations aren't ideal. You want to have a strong argument, but you want to back it up by strong presentation. Because keep in mind that at the end of the day, no matter how good your argument is, if it's really, really boring and no one wants to listen to it, it's going to be hard for people to actually sort of pay attention and people to actually focus. Now, that's not ideal, of course, but it's a psychological thing, right? Like no one's actively trying to make sure that they don't listen to you, but just as a function of your presentation style and your presentation ability, people may, be more switched on if you have a particular style of presenting. So that's something to keep in mind. John Bowers is actually going to be doing a webinar on how to give an effective speech from the perspective of presentation. I really encourage you to watch his webinar as well. When you, after you've watched this webinar, you may find all the information about when the webinars are taking place on the HMUN India website. And I really think that both our webinars together can be used in a combined fashion to create an effective speech. Because at the end of the day, that's the goal we're going for, rather than just an effective argument or just effective presentation. We want the whole package rather than the sum of the, just one of the parts, right? So with that being said, how to effectively structure an argument? So an argument is nothing more than a series of premises, a series of logical steps that lead to some kind of conclusion, right? And so the question really then begins, what kind of logical steps are important? How do you formulate these logical steps? How do you reach a solid conclusion? And how do you then effectively patch that together to prove your overall argument? So the way I like to think about this is I like to think of arguments in the form of a tree. So at the core or the trunk of the tree, you've got this base structure, right? And that base structure really depends on the core logic within your argument. So let's take an example, right? Let's say, for example, you're in my committee, the International Monetary Fund, and you're discussing oil security. You're discussing oil security, and that's a particularly important consideration for countries in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as other countries that are commodity linked in such a way, especially in the emerging markets, right? So oil is a particularly important thing that people care about. So, if, for example, if you were the United States, right, and you were talking to OPEC and Russia right now about whether or not you should cut production on oil so that emerging markets can benefit from the higher price in oil. Now, if you're the United States in that position, you need to consider also like where your interests lie, as well as where other people's interests lie. And so the way you find out the core logic for that trunk of your argument is by research. There's no other way around it. It's a difficult process, but in my experience, at least after having directed multiple conferences now, the delegates that come in with a solid understanding of the topic area, but also their position and other people's position, really do have the best shot of being able to engage effectively in the committee. And that's a very important consideration for directors when they're evaluating delegates, when they're thinking about how delegates perform. So having good research, there's no sort of easy way to do that. You go out there and you do research, and that gives you a good foundational understanding for that trunk of the argument, right? So then after that, and we'll talk a lot more about each one of these things in greater detail going forward. So after you've got that trunk of the argument, or the foundational core understanding of the topic area that forms your argumentation's background, the next step then is to build a series of logical steps in line with what your country believes in. So, for example, what's happening in the oil market right now, right? So let's do the research. The research is that we've got a situation where OPEC and Russia are trying to cut oil prices. Are trying to raise oil prices by cutting production. So that's a decrease in supply in order to increase price, right? But you've got the United States and several other producers out there who can operate their oil refineries at this price, at the price of oil right now, which is like mid-40s, right? And that really is a function of being able to produce really cheaply, having a lot of technological innovation. So that's really where the US producers, the shale oil producers, that's really where they're coming from. So you've got the decrease in supply by OPEC, you've got the increase in supply by the United States, and then you've also got a decrease in demand from places like China. And that's really interesting, because that sort of supply position now that's been mitigated now doesn't do so well when demand goes down. So that's really important to keep in mind when it comes to thinking about the oil price. So now we really have the fundamental research for this argumentation, right? The trunk core base logic of this argumentation. So now what do? We think from our position, let's assume we're the United States, let's build a series of logical steps that allow us to talk about the price of oil from a specific standpoint. Because in Model UN, it's important to give sort of a general big picture representation of what's going on, but it's also more important to further your country's position, to collaborate with other countries, and to make sure you reach some kind of conclusion, right? So then the next step is to say, okay, well, if I'm the United States of America, what do I care about? And I call this step finding your priorities, okay? So when it comes to finding your priorities, the important thing is to make sure that you understand your country's position and why it's different from other countries. And that is simply also a function of research, but it's also a function of thought. You have to sit down and really think through, what does my country care about? And what does my country care about that other countries don't care about? Because really, that's where the conflict points are going to occur. Those are the gray areas that people are really going to care about when it comes to formulating policy, right? Because if the entire committee agrees on something, then there may not necessarily be that much discussion or debate, but it's really in the finer nitty-gritty things that people care about. So, for example, when it comes to Russia and OPEC, right? If you were Russia in the current market today, you would say, yes, we want a higher price of oil, but as we found out last week, Russia doesn't want deeper cuts to the price of oil, to the supply of oil with OPEC. They don't simply think that's feasible for them. And they don't think that that's a good idea for their sort of balances of trade, as well as sort of the government income that they accrue from selling oil. So really, that's an important consideration for Russia. So while OPEC may want to still agree with Russia on the idea that yes, we need to raise the price of oil, OPEC may want deeper cuts in production compared to what Russia wants. So that's the critical juncture there, right? Russia and OPEC are going to agree that there should be a higher price of oil if we're talking about this, but they're not going to agree to what extent the cuts need to be implemented. And that's really where that discussion happens. So finding your priorities is important when you're structuring an argument because it shows you really what you care about. You need to sit down with your research and really think, what do I care about that other people may not necessarily care about in the same way? And that's really finding your priorities. Okay. The step after that is then selecting the most important priorities that your country has. Keep in mind that countries are very complex systems. They're very complex organizations. They have a lot of different things that they care about, right? The United States has differing policies for everything. And the policies that they have, even though they're connected by a general theme or thematic trend, they may sit very in stark, opposites to how the country sort of thematically operates, right? So finding your priorities are important, but your list of priorities might just be too big for you to be able to effectively talk about that stuff in a speech. Keep in mind that you're, in the actual United Nations and in other places where representatives from countries speak, people are a lot more lenient with time, and they're given the opportunity and the respect to speak for a much longer amount of time. So, coming up and delivering a 1-minute speech on your position may not necessarily be truly reflective of what goes on in the United Nations, but given constraints to our time and expectation, we may not necessarily address things in the same way. So you're going to have to whittle down your priorities to a few important things. And really, the way you rank these priorities determines how you interact with other delegates and how you go about making sure those priorities are realized in policy over the next, couple of days during the conference. So the way you find your priorities is you really think about the topic area, because that's what's most important, right? So you've done your research now, you've gone out there, you've talked about it, you find your priorities. The priorities really are the middle section of the tree, right? They're the area that helps the tree rise up and holds the tree in position. It makes up for the chunk of the tree that we're talking about when it comes to argumentation. So after you've then ranked those priorities and constructed that tree, what's then the most important thing? The most important thing after that is to have the branches, right? And the branches really are the sort of discussions and debates and sort of preemptive logic that you have of other places in the committee. So now you've found out what you care about. So the next step is to branch out, find out what everybody else cares about, and then try to formulate those things in line with your priorities. So let me just explain that again. So once you have selected your priorities, the most important thing then is to make sure that you have branched out. And what do I mean by branching out? By that I mean find out what other countries care about. So for example, right, let's say that I am OPEC right now, okay, and I care about a higher price of oil. That's my top priority, okay? I've done my research, I found my priorities, I've selected my priorities, I've whittled them down into the most important thing, a higher price of oil. Okay, so now I think about, all right, what does Russia care about? Russia also cares about a higher price of oil. Great, that's good. We can work things together. What does Russia not care about? Russia doesn't care so much for deeper cuts in production. So really, that branching out aspect will need me to focus on why can't we achieve a higher price of oil without deeper cuts? Because if I answer that question, then Russia's on my side, right? Because their top priority may also be to have a higher price of oil. So it's really about branching out and making sure that you have the opportunity to understand what other people care about, and then really thinking about how to branch out for that argument. So I have so that's really the tree structure. We'll go back and talk about how to do each one of these things, particularly research, because I want to talk about research qualities, and I want to talk a little bit more about how to effectively do that research, which is really important. But before I do that, I have a question from Aryan. So Aryan says, so in our research, what if our country barely has information and policies? Then how should I frame my policy? Can I frame my policies as per my allies' policies? Okay, so I'll talk about this a little bit more in detail when when we talk about research. But when I'm talking about research, I don't necessarily mean policy after policy. That's not necessarily the most important thing when it comes to a Model United Nations conference. Because yes, there are some policies out there that are important to consider and policies to keep in mind, but really it's your country's stance that we care about on the issue. So reading news from your local country, for example, would be a good way to think about this, and to think about where your country stands relative to other countries. And also, like, keep in mind that some countries have a lot more information than other countries, right? Like in the United States, if you wanted to get, say, census data, it would be pretty like easy to do that. You would be able to find like online places where you can get information like that. But at the same time, there are other countries out there where they don't publish that information, and that's fine. So we, as directors, we understand that certain countries have certain restrictions, that they don't necessarily allow certain information to be spread out to the general public, and we understand that. So if there's one delegate who has reams and reams and reams of research from the United States, sort of like, let's say, just like market regulators or whatever, right? At the same time, if another student from who's representing another country doesn't have that same information because their country doesn't allow it, the directors won't penalize them for that. So remember that directors spend a lot of time not just thinking about the topic area, but also picking which countries they want on their list. That's also something that the directors really do care about, because we're not, necessarily running like a full-size committee here with all the countries represented. So a lot of the countries we do pick have a very strong vested interest in the topic areas that we have chosen. And we choose them for a reason, because we know specifically that those countries will have something to say. So, even if you can't find policies, think about stance in general. And that's particularly important going forward. And I think that's how you should be thinking about it. Now, as for your ally stance, that's an important thing to know, right? So it's an important thing for you to understand that there are other people out there with similar interests to you, and that's great, because that means going into the committee session, you know that sort of maybe the first unmoderated caucus, you know who you're going to talk to. And you know who you're going to like sort of try to build a relationship with, so that you remain allies just like you are in the real world, right? So you can try to frame them around the stance of your allies, but I wouldn't think about them in policy perspective. I would rather think about them from a stance and news perspective, and then building your own research, finding your own priorities and your arguments from that research is more important. That branching out aspect I was talking about a little bit before, that's where you find out about your allies' policies. So I hope that answers your question, Aryan. So another question from Navya. So what if there are contradictions within your country? Which opinion would you state in your speech then if there are contradicting opinions by the same country? Okay, so when I said contradicting opinions, what I really meant by that was there are policies put in place in governments all around the world that may sit in tension with each other, because governments around the world continue to change, right? So while your position on one issue may necessarily be, let's say X, and your position on another issue may be Y, and those two things contradict each other, you may not necessarily be able to then, talk fully about an overarching issue, because you have two contradicting policies. So in a lot of the topics that we have chosen, which are complex topics, which involve a lot of discussion and debate, there will be contradictions. There will be people in your own countries who are of prominent power, who have like a prominent public influence, that talk about issues in a completely different or a completely diverging way. So while it's important to keep in mind that those topics are important, what's really important for you is to choose the side of that that's not just more relevant, but the side that you also think makes most sense. Remember, Model United Nations is not simply a parroting exercise, right? Like, you're not simply going up onto the dais and then repeating some speech that some other delegate from your own country gave a little while ago. The important thing for you as critical thinkers is to evaluate whether or not you think the stance of your country, if it contradicts, whether or not you think that contradiction is valid, A, and then which side of that contradiction you want to take your base on. So if it's a perfectly sort of even contradiction, which is what your speech sounds like, sorry, your question sounds like, in that case, you need to make that critical decision on how to choose the best argument. Not only choose the best argument, but do your research and then come to an argument, or do your research and come to a third argument that combines the positions of both these two contradictions. That would be the most effective way to not just show yourself, show the dais, but that you understand the topic, but also to show other delegates that you're willing to compromise. And that's a really important aspect when it comes to Model United conferences, especially HMUN India. So we'll do a couple more questions, and I'm going to go back to the tree structure that I was talking about, just to make sure that we have enough time to cover everything. I will leave some time at the end for questions. So about 10 more minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about my stuff, and then I'll answer any other questions. So in the meantime, if you have any other questions, I see 2 more questions right now. Please feel free to send it through the webinar. So let's go back to talking about the tree structure, right? So, and particularly within this, the one you really need to focus on, and the one that takes the longest amount of time, is the research. So as someone, who goes to a liberal arts school, who has written essays before, I really do understand that research can be difficult, and that research can be a challenging task, especially if you don't know where to start. So a good place to start, as always, is the background guide. The background guide, and I can tell you this from personal experience, after having written a couple of background guides, directors really do care extensively with what goes into their background guide. We spend a lot of time thinking about what to write, but also like what issues to write about specifically, about that sort of broader issue. Because the topics or the committees are really arranged in this like broad fashion with like several underlying issues that the directors care about, or at least that's how I structured within the International Monetary Fund, and then delegates discuss issues around those subtopics that they think are particularly relevant to the overarching discussion. So the reason why directors do that, or the reason why I do that at least, is to give delegates sort of some sort of ground, right, to be able to like talk about the topic in a more formulaic and structured way. And that's really why I create that kind of structure for people. Other directors may be different. But in my background guide, I have detailed, at least for the IMF, things that I particularly care about, things that I need delegates to really think about and consider when it comes to delivering an effective speech within the IMF committee. So you wanna keep in mind that that research that comes from the background guide is something the director has done, and it's something the director has already gone through the process of doing the research, finding the priorities, building those priorities, and then branching out and considering a lot of the different countries that exist. So director's done a lot of work for you there, right? So keep in mind that when you're starting your research, the first thing you want to do is you want to read the background guide, you want to make sure you understand the background guide. But then the background guide is not just a static document. The background guide has a section at the end with a lot of sources, right? So all of the sources that the director has used when constructing the background guide, as well as suggestions for further research, exist within the background guide. And those are links and topics and areas that you should predominantly focus sort of the early days of your research, because that'll give you a good foundational understanding on what the topic area is about, and what a lot of different opinions within the topic area are focusing about. So once you've done that further research with the background guide and then the suggestions for further research, and then sort of using the bibliography and thinking through, if you read the background guide and there is a particular paragraph you don't understand, the first thing you want to do is look at the source where the director either sort of got that structure from, got that fact from, or got that implementation from, and then really think through the research in that source with the context of what the director talked to you about in terms of the argument that exists in the background guide. So it's really a developing process, and it's all about showing initiative on your end as delegates to make sure that you have a sufficient understanding of the background of the topic for the committee to be able to make sure that you can effectively engage, okay? So background guide, first step process. The second thing you want to do is you want to be generally informed about the topic area. If the topic area is particular to a particular region, for example, mine focuses on development within African countries predominantly, you want to be able to make sure that you discuss those topics and you research those topics with other people as well, right? So the way you can research that first and foremost is general news, like what's been going on in those areas that are particularly important to you and that are particularly important to other members of your committee, right? So I've already detailed in my background guide like positions for situations where I think like blocks could form, and those kinds of blocks are sort of the news that you want to read, right? Like what is OPEC doing, for example, is an important thing. OPEC is made of an underlying number of countries, right? And like those countries, sometimes they have very differing policies, right? For example, like Libya may not necessarily want to cut back on any sort of production, excuse me, but Saudi Arabia at the same time wants to take a huge amount of cuts, right? So countries may disagree even though the overarching branch agrees. Making sure you understand sort of what that region or that block that the director thinks that your country is part of is thinking is also particularly important. And that's really where we go back to your question, Aryan, about what's important when it comes to your allies' policies, right? So those are the kinds of things to know, that in some situations you may be tied to a particular, policy or ally just by a function of like an organization you're part of, like OPEC, for example, right? So it's important to keep in mind that company, sorry, not company information, but that organizational information, that geographical information that comes from news is really relevant. So news, background guide, then the next thing is update papers. So assistant directors spend a lot of time writing update papers, and that's because we not only choose excellent assistant directors to come to our conferences, and they do a fantastic job, but they're all incredibly motivated and incredibly dedicated when it comes to writing update papers, and they do a lot of research to push delegates in an area that they think they wouldn't have considered up until this point, right? So use your update papers as a springboard for a new area of discussion that the background guide doesn't necessarily focus on or doesn't do so with as much detail. And really then it's about researching the area that the update paper talks about to be able to make sure that you can sufficiently talk about the area that the update paper is trying to push you to. So really it's that research focus that comes with the background guide, that comes with news, that comes with update papers, that gives you the sort of background definition of what your country really cares about. I know that sounds like a lot of reading, and I totally understand, but it's important to keep in mind that we're in a conference that values research. We're in a conference that values collaboration. We're in a conference that values ideas at the end of the day. So even if you're not reading everything, and I don't want delegates to push themselves to read everything they can, I want delegates to really spend time critically evaluating and thinking about the kinds of arguments, the kinds of research that they come across. For me, quality is always more important than quantity. It doesn't matter to me how many facts you can tell me about the topic area. It matters to me how many good arguments you can make about the position that you exist in. So now that we've talked a little bit about research, and of course there's a lot of academic research that you can do outside of this, right? There's a lot of sources on the internet that you can do outside of this, but sort of a general background area, you want to talk about the background guide, you want to talk about the update papers, and you want to definitely read sort of geographical information if your committee discusses things in that particular way. Okay, so then once you've done that, I would recommend sort of writing a list of all the priorities that you think are important to your country and that are important to the committee on two separate sides. Figure out what are the differences between that, then select the priorities that are most important to you, and then sort of build the argument based on that priority, right? Because you want to be able to branch out and think about what other people care about, and then formulate a series of logical steps that lead to a conclusion. Now I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the conclusion, which is really important when it comes to structuring an argument, because a series of logical steps are not important, or the point isn't being driven home if you don't have a conclusion at the end of the day, right? So, for example, let's say that I'm Saudi Arabia in OPEC. OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and they are like just a big oil cartel that exists within the region. Sorry, I should have explained that. Um, so let's say I'm Saudi Arabia, right? And you know, I care about a higher price of oil, and so what I say is, well, look, we are the price of oil has decreased a lot over the last year. That's background, right? That provides the first logical background for what we're supposed to do. Then I say, okay, in order to effectively sort of balance our budgets as well as make money and revenue and everything else for our economy and our government to function properly and our society to be effective, where a lot of which depends on oil, we're going to have to increase the price of oil. Okay, so the way we do that is through production cuts. Okay, so then what's the total effect of this, right? Like, what's the conclusion here? The conclusion is that you want other people to also be involved when it comes to cutting their oil production, because you don't have the power to affect global oil markets on your own, right? And that's fine. But that conclusion is really like that call to action is what's important when it comes to structuring an argument, when it comes to understanding what's most important to you, to others, bringing them together, and then forming a conclusion for how you can create a policy that solves a lot of the problems that the committee has, right? Rather than just your individual problem. The talented delegate is the delegate that can solve, that can make most other delegates see in the same way he or she does, to be able to effectively lead a committee in that way, to be able to effectively collaborate with a committee, which is way more important in that way, right? So that's really what I have for you when it comes to how to structure an argument. So remember, research, find your priorities, select your priorities, branch out, form a strong, effective conclusion. And that's how you structure an argument. And at least that's in my perspective. I want to say this again, that people have a lot of different ways of structuring arguments, a lot of different ways of thinking about what's most important to them. Just keep in mind that what I'm telling you may not necessarily be the best way for you personally, but it's the way that I use, and I thought that would be helpful for you. So I'm going to spend the last 10 minutes now just answering a couple of questions, and then we'll call it a day here. So, okay. So then the next question is from Anushri, and the question is, what if my country is barely involved in the agenda and so there is no information? So I would be a little bit wary of saying your country is not involved at all within your committee, because that's unlikely. The topic areas that we tend to choose try to be very broad. They try to encapsulate a lot of the countries that are involved within the committee session. They definitely have a position for all of the countries involved in the committee session. So I would make sure that you fully understand where your committee is coming from, as well as like what your country's role in that position is. So I would just recommend a little bit more research before you come to that conclusion. Of course, always, like, throughout this entire argument process, as well as like research process, reaching out to your directors, trying to like formulate a discussion there and like build an understanding is also important. Like, you can always email your directors and say, hey, I've done this research, but I'm finding it really hard to find things about this particular policy or this particular situation or this particular circumstance. Is there any way you can help me or push me in the right direction, so that I can build my research for these particular topics, right? So you can feel free to state that out to your director. Feel free to get in touch if you're feeling like there's no information out there for you. Okay, so the next question after that is, so should your allies be based on your country's interests? How does this affect your stance in HMUN, as it's not the real world? So I'm not sure I particularly understand that question. So yes, there are allies out there that are based on the actual country's interests, and you should try to, like, as best as possible, stick within the formulations of those policies, right? Like, you want to make sure that you don't go out there and say that one of your strongest allies is now your enemy or something like that. Just on day one, like, just be kind of, go crazy for that situation, right? That'd be strange. The director would definitely pick up on that. A lot of other delegates would be like, well, what's going on here? So I don't necessarily recommend like diverging away from your country's policies. That being said, you have some flexibility here, right? So while, for example, on the first day, there is a certain expectation that you come in and defend your country's positions, things do evolve and change over the course of HMUN. And the point there is that Model UN is really a flexible, dynamics process. And what you come up with at the end of conference really is what matters. It's like, days and days of just building your position, collaborating with other people, thinking about what matters most, and at the end, what you may come to may not necessarily be with what you started with, right? And that's totally fine. Like, directors understand that at the end of the day, we're finding solutions to policies, we're doing things without like a full, deep understanding of how these things work in the real world, and that's totally fine. We're asking and challenging you to put yourself in the position of the people who are actually representing these countries, but don't feel like you are hamstrung to just support the policies that your country does. Keep in mind that flexibility is an important part of Model United Nations. Collaboration is the most important part when it comes to HMUN India specifically. So then the next question is, so I'm in the IRCC as I have received a character rather than a country. Is there anything different that I should do in a GSL? So I can't see the name for this. It seems to be blocked out. Well, I would reach out to your director about that situation. It seems that you might be in a specialized agency situation where you're like given where you're in a situation where you've been given like a specific GSL situation. So where you've been given a specific character situation rather. Sorry. So reach out to your director and like talk to them a little bit about how they want you to structure that position. So keep in mind that character is essentially what they're doing is they're just zooming down to a particular situation, right? And different characters have different sort of agendas and different things that they care about. Now, that while that's really important, it's really no different than thinking about it from a country perspective. Rather, you're an individual with specific individual agendas and goals and things you want to do, and individual allies, maybe not in the same formalized way as like trade agreements that countries have, but similar stuff. My structuring an argument and research still follows the same format as I discussed before. So I'm going to then do one more question, and then I'm going to call it a day. If you have any other questions, I can see some like specific IMF questions. If you would rather, please just email the IMF email. That'd be very much appreciated. You can find so it's imf@hmunindia.org. You can find all the emails for your directors on the HMUN India website. So the last question then from Kriti is, along with that, should we also state some of our proposed solutions? Okay, so the proposed solutions is an important part of the conclusion when it comes to building an argument, right? So, for example, let's go back to the OPEC situation that I was talking about before, and then let's think about it that way. So, let's say, for example, I'm Saudi Arabia, and I say, this is really bad. Like, the price of oil is so low, it's so difficult for me to run my government reserves or like balance my budget in the right way. Research argument two, my other countries also care about the price of oil. It's my ally countries also care about the price of oil. It's really difficult for us to find sort of a balanced budget in this sort of global macro environment. And then you really think about, so let's say that those are your priorities, you've selected your priorities, you've branched out, and you've thought about what other countries care about. Your conclusion can then be, we should create a supply cut so that the price of oil goes higher. That is something that's a solution. It's a conclusion to the argumentation that you've gone through the process of research, you found your priorities, you selected your priorities, you branched out, and now you formed a conclusion that illustrates the importance of your argument, but also provides a solution for how the committee or how the group of countries you're concerned about can go forward and effectively solve the situation. So that's really where I would say your proposed solutions are important going forward. So thanks again for your time today. I really, do appreciate all of you coming out and coming onto this webinar. It's really important that, you get as much exposure to to the directors as possible. So I really encourage viewing all of the webinars and making sure that you have all the information you need to have a wonderful conference. So I have a sort of quick reminder, a couple of reminders. So I'm told to remind you to read through the background guide, as I've already done. If you need the password, please email info@hmunindia.org. And I encourage you to email all of your directors with any substantive question, email all your directors, and if you have any sort of substantive questions, or if you have any organizational questions, or sort of like logistical questions, I would email sort of info@HMUN Your directors are the key focal point for any sort of substantive questions you have on your committee, whereas secretariat, who works incredibly hard in the background to make conference run, they're the ones really who know the logistical framework for how the conference is going to go. So if you have any questions along those lines, please email info@hmunindia.org. Your position papers are due Monday, July 24th. Please upload them to Mondays. Information about position papers is also in the guide to delegate preparation. And if you have any questions on that, please do email me, and please do email any of your other directors or info@HMUN if you have any questions. So thanks again for coming. This was a lot of fun. I hope you learned some useful things about at least how to formulaically structure an argument and how to think about where to go from not knowing very much about your argument, but to be able to have sort of a formalized, researched, prioritized argument at the end of the day. So thank you very much for your time. I'm hoping to meet all of you when I come to HMUN India this year. Happy researching, and I hope you have a great